Order à l'ordre. The Public Order Emergency Commission is now in session. La commission sur l'état d'urgence est maintenant ouverte.
Good morning, bonjour. So this morning we have a presentation and then it'll be followed by three witnesses. So first, the presentation.
Good morning, Commissioner. Jeff Leon, Commission Counsel. This morning we're going to shift gears and focus on what has been a very important part of this Commission's work, that is the views of the Canadian public. It's our pleasure to present to you an overview summary of the results of our public submission process. As you know, shortly after your appointment, you committed to providing an opportunity for members of the public to participate in the work of the Commission. That's essential to have a full and complete picture for the Commission's deliberations. The public submission process was launched in August. At that time, you again commented on the importance of the Commission receiving, and I quote, meaningful public input from a wide range of Canadians, not just those individuals and entities who have been granted standing. This is in keeping with my commitment to conduct an open and transparent public inquiry that provides an opportunity for involvement by all Canadians. The public submission process ran until October 31st, and I'm pleased to report that it was a success. The Commission received almost 9,500 submissions from a broad cross-section of Canadians. In terms of age, respondents self-identified as being from all age groups, but primarily 25 to 44 and 45 to 64, which is consistent with Canadian statistics as being representative of the Canadian population. In terms of location, we heard from respondents in 9 provinces or territories across Canada, primarily British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, which again is consistent with the fact that these provinces contain the largest concentrations of population in Canada. In terms of those who were responded, we heard from those involved in the protests, community members affected by the protests, and members of the public who wanted to tell the Commission about their views in terms of the work that the Commission has undertaken. Indeed, the Commission undertook to review all these submissions. A final report is being prepared, and this presentation will be a summary of the matters to be covered in that report. You will see that we have been successful in collecting, indeed, a wide variety of views, observations, ideas, and experiences of Canadians on all aspects of the Commission's mandate, including the circumstances that led to the declaration of a public order emergency and the measures taken for dealing with the declared emergency in February of 2022. We received submissions in 3 ways through an online questionnaire, email, and mail. Overall, these submissions have been of great assistance to the Commission in appreciating how the matters being considered affected and impacted Canadians. They provide background and context for the Commission to inform its deliberations in this inquiry, which, after all, is a public inquiry. I note that this overview that we will now present is not evidence. Like some of the other background presentations that have been tabled, it will be posted on the Commission's website. On behalf of the Commission, we extend our thanks to the many Canadians who generously took time and made the effort to assist in the Commission's process. You have performed an important service as Canadians. I will now ask my colleague Sajeda Heraldi to present the summary, after which I will share with I will share with you excerpts from a few of the actual submissions we received to give a firsthand flavor of the breadth and quality of these submissions.
Go ahead. Allez-y.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. For the record, I'm Sajida Hyderali, Commission Counsel. As mentioned by Mr. Leon, this presentation is a summary of the comments that the Commission received from the public. It would be impossible to attempt to convey every point made in the over 9,000 submissions we received in this presentation, but we hope to convey important parts of what was shared with us. As you will see, we have organized the presentation around various themes that were collated from the comments that we received. La présentation de ce matin sera bilingue.
This morning's presentation will be bilingual, and if you need headsets, please take one.
So first, if we can go to the next slide, please, Mr. Clerk. D'abord, parlons du contexte de la pandémie de COVID-19 qui a été exprimé par plusieurs membres du public. Plusieurs personnes ont discuté d'un sentiment d'exclusion et d'isolement qui était dû ou bien de leur statut vaccinal ou de leurs opinions contre les mesures sanitaires.
First, people talked about a feeling of isolation. Next slide.
Selon ces personnes, ces commentaires que nous avons reçus, les mesures sanitaires ont été en place pendant trop longtemps.
According to those people, the sanitary measures lasted too long and make things hard for them.
Les événements sociaux, etc. Et ils sentaient une certaine
They would feel some discrimination due to the political nature around those COVID measures.
From people who felt pride in the convoy. For them, the convoy brought a sense of belonging among people who shared similar views on the pandemic. These people had a sense of obligation to participate in these protests to defend the rights and freedoms of Canadians. Some of those people also acknowledged the impact on the Ottawa residents of the protests, but in their view, the nation's capital belonged to all Canadians and they were still justified to be there. They were proud to have been part of an important grassroots movement. Ces mêmes personnes avaient généralement
The same people had a peaceful vision of the protests. For example, we have here a quote. The person was moved by the respect that was seen around during the protests. Several people talked about the 3 weeks of demonstrations in Ottawa, and they saw there no violence, vandalism, misogyny, racism, or hate. And any problem that might have been seen were exceptions. What came out of those demonstrations were rather good actions, like distributing foods, cleaning the streets, or removing the snow.
We also received comments from community members who were affected by the protests. Many people expressed that their mental health was impacted by the protests. Some felt trapped in their homes. Next slide, please, Mr. Clerk. The continuous honking was disturbing to them. They also had difficulty breathing and headaches due to the diesel emissions from stationary truck engines. They also talked about the impact of road closures, and limited public transport. For example, various appointments had to be rescheduled for health services. They also reported lack of mental health support. Ces personnes craignaient également
Those people also feared for their own safety. They found that they had never seen so many people committing crime and jeopardizing people for a political opinion. Those people mentioned stress, anger, and fear. Some also talked about some harassment and aggressive behavior that they saw from some demonstrators, and they experienced that. Some people were harassed for wearing a mask in a public space. Some felt that some demonstrators were on a personal mission to hound down masked people wearing a mask. So they felt that they were more at risk of being the target of such discourse. So some incidents were not investigated, and they found that the rules and regulations did not apply.
We've also heard a lot about disruption to daily life. We have here a quote, I'm a 65-year-old retired high school teacher who relies on my volunteering shifts at the museum to remain active both physically and mentally. The prolonged COVID shutdown of the museum was difficult for me, and the ensuing protest exacerbated the personal impact. These personal impacts included deprivation of peace, quiet, and sleep. Many people also reported being unable to work effectively or work at all, indeed. And as mentioned earlier, many residents had to make drastic changes to their schedules. There were also impacts on non-governmental organizations and charity who had to adjust their services and could not serve the community in the way that they would have hoped to. There were also impacts on local businesses and services. Residents reported difficulties obtaining various services or getting groceries, for example, and some downtown businesses also had to close, which resulted in an important loss of income, which was particularly important to them because of the previous COVID-19 measures that had been imposed. Les membres du public qui s'opposaient aux manifestations
The members of the public opposed to the protests told us that they are for freedom of speech, but that this went too far. When their own rights were infringed upon, that would go too far. They felt that there ought to be some limits. One person said that demonstrators talked about freedom, but not of their own responsibilities as citizens. For those people, demonstrations jeopardized the Canadian democracy. Those people who were against the demonstration felt anger. Demonstrators claimed to represent all Canadians, whereas that was not the case. For several people, the protests were simply an opportunity for frustrated individuals to participate in a unique event and to burn off excess energy in the name of freedom.
Let's now turn to media coverage of the protests. We've heard several comments on misrepresentation and excessive media coverage. We have a comment here, media lied about all of it. They wanted people not in Ottawa to think the protesters were a bunch of redneck hooligans causing mayhem. This is fairly representative of many comments that we received, which expressed low levels of trust for mainstream media compared to new media such as YouTube or other social media. In their view, mainstream media was misrepresenting the facts surrounding the protests. And in their view, that was often because these organizations receive subsidies from the state and therefore are mouthpieces for the government. Many people also expressed that excessive media coverage of the exceptions in Ottawa who displayed signs with profanity or historical hate symbols were being represented excessively and didn't actually represent the people who were at the protests. And these people expressed emotional distress at being associated with these hateful symbols. On nous a également parlé du discours du gouvernement fédéral par rapport
So there was also a mention of the federal government discourse, and this was aiming at dividing the population. For many people, political representatives at the federal level tried to discredit the convoy. They just tried to feed the dominant discourse according to which the demonstrators were only representing a minority. This discourse affected the public negatively towards the demonstrators. They felt ostracized and discriminated against.
They perceived that the federal government had different standards when it came to different types of protests. They expressed that in recent years there had been numerous protests of a violent nature in Canada that led to various blockades, for example, led by different groups with different interests than theirs. And yet the act had never been invoked to deal with these excesses. And indeed, the Prime Minister had met with most of these groups. Those people found that the invocation of the act not only was disproportionate, but was also vindictive toward protesters with whom the government did not share values. Plusieurs nous ont dit que
Several people said that there could have been a peaceful resolution of the protests if there had been negotiations. The only thing to do, as this protester says here, was to talk to the truckers and solve things. But instead of that, they called people a small fringe minority with unacceptable views, quote unquote. Demonstrators wanted to be heard and to be taken into account. Yet they said that the federal government didn't want to hear other viewpoints and solve the situation in a peaceful manner. Some people add that as a measure of goodwill, some trucks were moved and people were expected this action to lead to further negotiations with government officials. This did not work. Some people say that the application of the law following this measure of goodwill was an abuse of power. Coutts and Windsor had been lifted blockades before the invocation of the Act, which feeds their opinion that the invocation of the law is abusive.
we have heard of many different kinds of frustrations against politicians. This time, in this slide, expresses frustrations toward politicians who supported the protests rather than those who didn't meet with the protesters. So some people expressed frustration because some politicians chose to support the protesters for what seemed to be merely political gain. And for them, the invocation of the act was the only possible outcome to clear the occupation. And all political debates and discussions between different political parties were unnecessary, non-collaborative, and not in the best interest of residents, especially in Ottawa.
This sense of abandonment was expressed by several people who also talked about a lack of confidence vis-à-vis the authorities. This sense of abandonment also was towards the police and law enforcement. They wondered how 3 police forces could not control a protest that was highly predictable. Had the police been more organized and had they acted quicker? We also asked the reasons why regulatory tools had not been used, as in ticketing. One submission stated that the police inaction prompted residents to come together to prevent more truck access to the downtown core and those counter-protests that we heard about.
This leads to the next point. Some people told us the act might not have been necessary if law enforcement had acted earlier. People spoke of failures by multiple levels of government. For the city of Ottawa, they said that the city should have limited truck access to designated zones without the city, which would have avoided the blockade, what they call a blockade. They also say that the Ottawa police remained inactive despite various complaints that they received of harassment and intimidation by residents of Ottawa. We were also told that we also received criticisms concerning the province of Ontario that only took action once the economic impacts of the border blockade in Windsor became apparent. And these people told us that Ontario could have dealt with the crisis, but instead passed on responsibility to the federal government. And of course, we also received criticism from the federal government about the federal government's action, pardon.
I'll now deal more generally with the comments of the invocation of the Act. I'll talk about first bit, so those who found the invocation necessary and others who found it unjustified. For those who found it necessary, the invocation of the Act provided relief. The results following the invocation of the Act demonstrate its necessity, and that's how they managed to clear crowds and opening roads. The use of the Act allowed downtown residents to regain some semblance of normal life and a sense of security, and for others to return to their downtown residences that they had to vacate. The invocation of the Act was an appropriate, measured, and targeted response to end border blockades and protests. These peoples also talked to us about extremist and violent elements in the convoy posed a danger to Canadians and to democracy. And when all the options had been exhausted, it was a last recourse. The federal government had to act in order to protect the population by using any means possible.
We've also heard from others that the invocation of the Act was unjustified and inappropriate. For those people, the protests in Ottawa were peaceful and did not meet the requirements needed to invoke the Act. There was no serious or immediate danger to the lives, health, or safety of Canadians. The Act was invoked while all other options had not been exhausted, and that led to violent confrontations between police and protesters. These people also told us that existing laws should have been enforced by local and provincial authorities. The criminal code, notably other laws and bylaws, could have been sufficient to manage any illegal behavior. For them, the decision to use the Act was a political one by frustrated federal officials who had no sympathy for the protesters. On nous a parlé de crainte.
We also heard about fear at the time of the declaration of the public order emergency. One person told us that when the Emergency Act was invoked, I was overwhelmed with fear. Will my bank account be frozen because I had shared videos of the convoy on my social media? I went to the bank and emptied my account. Would I be arrested for attending the convoy in Ottawa? I decided not to wait and see. I fled Canada. And later on, he said, when the law was invoked, they showed me that no law, constitution, or charters had provided the protection. These fears were multiple in nature. There were fears of physical violence by the police and of tear gas and the force used to move and to tow the trucks. Fear of being investigated and arrested for activities predating the invocation of the Act. Fear of repercussion for online support of protesters. fear of loss of livelihood if bank accounts were to be frozen. And some left the country altogether. This brings us to the direct impacts of the act on the life of the protesters and those who supported them.
Some people reported that they suffered physical injury from the use of cayenne pepper, batons, and anti-riot gear. Many found themselves in a precarious situation because of their inability to access their bank accounts for various periods of times, and many questioned their trust in banking institutions. Cette perte de confiance est également étendue envers le gouvernement et les institutions.
This lack of confidence also touched the government and other institutions, namely the police and financial institutions. For some people, the invocation of the act created a precedent. It was seen as being an attack on any group opposing government views. Some said that they would never donate to charities again out of fear of action against their bank accounts if that charity is later opposed to the current sitting government. Perception that rights, freedoms, free speech and protest have been destroyed.
This loss of trust for some also led to persistent fear of the government and of institutions. Some people expressed that they were now anxious to participate in general political discourse because of the repercussions that might have in their lives. They were scared of being monitored for their political view, and they also are now scared in the presence of police and are scared of being arrested for their political views. D'autres personnes nous ont également évoqué un sentiment.
Other people mentioned a feeling of fear for different reasons. We have here somebody here. As the protest continued, I began to realize that they were more anti-government than anti-vaccine. This is when I began to feel frightened. These people were asking to overturn the government, and nobody was stopping them. I began having fears for my own country. And these people, in fact, had anxiety towards the potential downfall of Canada's democratic systems. They were cynical vis-à-vis the continued display of anti-government rhetoric, pointing out that this was a new and disturbing phenomenon. Many urge institutions to take the threat against the country's democratic system seriously. The protests were fueled by rage, and that type of movement can reemerge at any time. And these people saw that the protests as an alert for what could happen in the future.
We have also heard about the damage and change in perception to Canadian symbols. We've heard of people who are now anxious when they see a Canadian flag while they used to be proud of being Canadians. A community member told us, "I want my flag back," quite simply. For these people, the image of the Canadian flag has changed. Its symbolism has been tainted, and they were heartbroken by the use of Canadian symbols by the protesters. They now associate these symbols with the protests, with hate speech, and with intolerance. And these people do not understand the casual behavior of the authorities. The use of the flag for political purposes, for example, and then also the symbolic gesture of flying it upside down, altered people's attachment to the Canadian flag and their sense of pride, and they now have a sense of distrust when they see cars flying a Canadian flag. On nous a également exprimé
We also heard about damage to Canada's international reputation. And we heard that from all over. Some expressed a sense of shame toward the handling of demonstrations by the authorities. For these people, it was the inaction that caught the media attention that has damaged Canada's reputation as a nation upholding the rule of law. Others believed that the invocation of the Act was unjustified and has hurt Canada's reputation as a democratic society and wouldn't let people express their opinions. First of all, the loss of pride in Canadian identity, as we said earlier, with the flag, and because the association with extremist elements. These people felt that there was also an impact on Canada's international reputation. People also expressed worries about the relationship between Canada and the U.S. The impact of this, the impact was symbolic, economic, and diplomatic in terms of Canada's relationship with the rest of the world. Some feel less secure in their rights of the ability to do business in Canada, especially after the freezing of bank accounts.
We have also heard some concerns over foreign influence. There was a perception that the online donations allowed foreign donors to interfere in a domestic issue. And many people believe that the convoy was inspired by the events of January 6, 2021 in the United States Capitol. There was a widespread belief that far-right ideologies and anti-government rhetoric is growing and spreading, and that was reinforced by actors in the United States during the protests. Passons maintenant aux recommandations du public.
Let's look at the recommendations of the public regarding the Act. And then we'll go to more general recommendations from the public. With regard to the Act, several people told us that it should not be possible to invoke the Act by simple majority in Parliament. The threshold for invoking the Act should be more restrictive, and there were several suggestions on how to do that. We were told that the authority to invoke the Act without greater oversight from other government institutions should be reduced. And finally, that the terms and the language within the Act should be better defined. We were told that the Act allowed the police forces to work together in Ottawa and to get rid of jurisdictional borders. And we were told that the law should be examined so that the interventions be adjusted depending on the seriousness of the situation. Specifically for the Ottawa region, we were told that the law should take into account the single jurisdictions in Ottawa, and more clarity was necessary with regard to the role of the various police forces and public order forces in Ottawa. Several people told us that the threshold should be high to make sure that its use is not disproportional to the gravity of the situation.
Finally, let's turn to general recommendations from the public. Many people told us that future protests should always require a permit and that the use of motorized vehicles in a protest should be prohibited. We also heard that a bylaw or law to mitigate engine idling should be adopted. In times of crisis, various legal entities and government bodies must coordinate with one another to resolve jurisdictional disputes. And we were told that that should be clarified. We also were told that there should be more consequences, more legal consequences for people who deliberately spread lies, misinformation, and hate. And that social media platforms that host misinformation and disinformation should also be targeted by such laws. We were told that the use of the Confederate flag and other hate symbols in Canada should be banned, and that the government must do better to educate and prevent the radicalization of Canadians. Laws that curtail foreign funding of anti-democratic groups and movements within Canada should be enacted. There should be a firmer application of standards of behavior in police forces and in military forces, and screening practices for hiring these personnel is necessary. And finally, we were told that there should be better support for the press and journalists, given their essential function in countering misinformation and disinformation. I will now pass the baton back to Mr. Leon, who will conclude with a few quotations from the comments that we have received. Encore une fois, merci à tous ceux et celles.
Once again, thank you to one and all who took part in the public submissions.
Commissioner Jeff Leon, Commission Counsel, having heard this summary, which is of necessity given the large number of submissions, is at a high level, it will be helpful to understand in the respondents' own words their views and how the events under consideration impacted them. You will hear a variety of views from across Canada, which is reflective of the diverse reaction of Canadians to the issues before this commission. First, I live in Victoria, BC, in the neighborhood behind the provincial legislature, James Bay to be exact. At the height of the Freedom Convoy, I worked part-time for a small family-run retail establishment located in Victoria. We were forced to close the shop early 3 Saturdays in a row due to the constant honking, some of it amplified over loudspeakers. The constant honking was anxiety-inducing. Customers who did come in did not stay. I do not know how much revenue was lost, but winter is our busiest season. Saturday, the busiest day. The owners were kind and gracious enough to pay us. I felt bad taking the money. This is only part of how the convoy affected me. I walked to work, so the entire way home, constant horns blasting could be heard blocks away. It is a half-hour walk. Once I reached my neighborhood, protesters were also on foot. They were loud, in some cases inebriated, and menacing. They exhibited behavior as a group I am sure they would not attempt individually. This behavior continued daily for months. Elderly were scared to leave their homes. I was most distressed that it took as long as it did to invoke the Emergency Act. Second, the convoy protest in Winnipeg impacted our mental health significantly. We live near the legislature where the convoy honked, blocked streets, emergency vehicles forced to take longer routes, waved offensive signs, harassed locals for wearing masks at a bus or in local food or coffee shops, parked on streets blocking locals. The loud honking hours, long vehicle parade with flags was an assault. Our mental health was severely impacted, and any complaints to police were seen as a few complainers repeating and therefore of no real consequence. Our police did nothing. Plus, the abuse of the Canada flag caused us not to put up our flag on July 1st. We felt helpless. We had to get away to a hotel for several days to keep our sanity. We felt on the edge of sanity until the Emergency Act finally came in and suddenly things happened. With that, our police would not have ended this as quick. We kept hoping the federal government would enact that step because this protest should never, ever, ever have gotten away with this outright lawlessness and disregard for fellow citizens. This lack of action has forever changed our country for the worse, shaken our confidence in protection. The Emergency Act was absolutely necessary. We also believe it was ended quickly, showing there was no intent to abuse its power. It was the reason we finally got some relief, even here in Winnipeg. As a lasting impact, we are attempting to find a way to move out of this area because even now, any significant honking on Broadway hits with a fear the protesters are back. Hours of honking past our apartment block changed our life because no one stopped it until the Emergency Act came in and Ottawa was being cleaned up, and then and only then did our police act. We were shattered. I am a hospital pharmacist in Windsor, Ontario. Our border was blocked by protesters connected to the Ottawa protests. I did not personally need to cross the border during that time, but I did experience shortages of some food and commodities that are transported through the border. I am also angry that my city had to use taxpayers' money to deal with these circumstances. I resent the fact that money could have been used constructively to improve the city was instead used to manage and contain the protesters. As a healthcare worker, I literally risked my life to go into the hospital where I worked and cared for sick people who required our services. If a protester was one of the people needing my skills, I would provide it with the same diligence and empathy as with any other patient. In contrast, the protesters seem not to respect the needs of community members, at best inconvenienced and at worst terrorized by their occupation. Everyone has a right to protest, but they do not have the right to prevent others from carrying out daily activities, having access to food or supplies, or simply feeling safe in their neighborhoods. Number 4. I am writing to express my sincerest opinions and experiences regarding the Freedom Convoy protest and the implementation of the Emergencies Act. This letter will provide what I hope to be a useful recount of a working-class Canadian citizen who believes in freedom and the Charter-guaranteed rights to democratic protest. In the months of January and February of 2022, I made the long drive to Ottawa from Scarborough to peacefully protest in the Freedom Convoy. As a COVID-19 unvaccinated Canadian, I had already been facing discrimination, oppression, and hate for 2 years as a direct result of the federal government's politicization of the vaccine. I am a young, active, healthy woman who had no medical need nor personal desire to take an experimental vaccine. I was ridiculed by my peers and strangers alike, banned from leaving and re-entering my own country, public transit, sports leagues, restaurants, and shopping centers, to name a few. My decision to maintain medical and bodily autonomy nearly cost me my job. These vaccine mandates were systematically being imposed sector by sector, leaving hardworking Canadians to be either coerced into sacrificing bodily autonomy or stripped of their livelihoods. Many of my COVID-19 unvaccinated family and friends were horrified and panicked at the very real possibility of having to flee our own country, a country which has stood for freedom and equality for over 150 years, until the truckers stopped them. The Freedom Convoy was a beacon of hope to millions of Canadians who face threats, job suspension, and getting canceled online as a result of expressing dissent. Through propaganda and polarization of the media, myself and many others were made to believe that there was nobody else out there who held the same perspective. We were made to believe that we had no ground to stand on, and that if we spoke up, there would be no one there to back us up. And then came the news of a trucker convoy bound for our nation's capital and inviting anyone and everyone to join. Here was finally a place where we could take a stand and show our government that we did not agree. The Freedom Convoy protests represent a new marker in Canadian history. They brought Canadians together. They brought the world together. Inspiring protests in countries all over the world, the repercussions of the convoy spread far beyond what we could have ever imagined. Citizens of other countries waved Canadian flags, sang the Canadian national anthem, and messaged and commented on social media in support of the Canadians. We became the pinnacle of a peaceful protest. I would like the Commission to take a moment to process what that must have felt like to have spent hours, even days, waving a Canadian flag, singing "O Canada," shoulder to shoulder with strangers, inviting our government to engage in a discussion about our democratic rights, and instead being labeled and criticized so harshly. Please imagine enduring the extreme cold temperatures, holding a sign above your head, just so you can finally have your voice heard and your life back. Imagine seeing people laughing together and dancing and standing guard on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Imagine just wanting your freedom back, not more, nothing demanding, just what you already had before. Then you come home, watch the news, and see yourself labeled as a domestic terrorist, as someone who does not represent the views of Canadians. 5, I supported the trucker convoy for many reasons and in many ways. I have truckers in my family, and they were coerced into taking the vaccines, and one family member was out of a job. The mandates and vaccine policies in this country have affected my children, myself, and my family in so many ways. They have created a huge divide amongst us, those who opted to take the vaccine and those who abstained. My family will never get back to where we were before COVID. So when the trucks rolled out on their way to Ottawa, I supported them however I could. I donated to the GoFundMe page and then doubled my portion to Give, Send, Go when GoFundMe shut down. I have yet to see my money back from Give, Send, Go. I sent my kids out to the bridge overpass to wave on the trucks as they rolled down the highway towards Ottawa. The second weekend of the protest, I took the 7-hour car ride to Ottawa to see for myself what was happening downtown. I have never in my life seen such selfless people giving their time and energy to support such a noble cause. It was crowded and noisy due to the trucks running in the streets and honking, and the immense amount of people there made noise. But it was music to my ears. It was a reuniting of Canadian people. It was the Canada I knew from 25 years ago when I traveled abroad. People of all provinces had gathered to become family. All nationalities were represented. It was wonderful. It was the best Canada Day celebrations I have ever participated in. It gave me such pride for Canada again. Such joy to be a part of, the waving Canadian flags, the happy people singing, dancing, and yes, there were bouncy castles for the little people. There was food in the streets to feed armies. It was unbelievable. The joy I felt watching the videos of the trucks rolling down the highway for this reunification of our people who had been so isolated and trapped for 2 years, and then seeing it set up in Ottawa to be able to partake in was phenomenal. There was no violence, and the police were literally standing around everywhere trying to keep warm, but in reality had nothing to do in the areas I walked around downtown. There was nothing to fear, and people were kind and loving all weekend. 2 weeks later, I took the trip to Ottawa again. Unfortunately, this trip was much less enjoyable because the police had already blocked the downtown entrances, and we heard of the violence that had already occurred with regard to the trucks, the vandalism, the tear gas. I made it to Coventry and heard from the trucks that got out just in time. They described the violence they had already experienced and witnessed. One trucker described as having been tear gassed, his eyes were still itchy. I ran into a reporter who had been physically harmed by officers during covering the story. It got ugly due to the officers. It wasn't the supporting protesters causing this. I met many of the helpers at Coventry who had been there since day one, and the stories we were able to share with one another about the purpose of this protest were beautiful. Number 6. Thank you for the opportunity to give feedback on this polarizing issue in our country. I believe that evoking the Emergencies Act was the correct thing to do. And if anything, I would like to have seen a more forceful dispersion of protesters and others who engaged in these reckless and irresponsible actions. I was not a protester myself, nor was I in the capital city at the time of this event. However, I can attest to the broad reach of this group's influence and the effects it had on other provinces besides Ontario. These individuals threatened the entire country with their negligence by attacking our already frail food chain supply through the use of blockades. Living in Newfoundland, a large concern has always been if we will have enough food shipped onto the island to make sure everyone can get by. Although this group was unsuccessful with completely stunting the food supply chain, it still did a number on our ability to get needed goods. Walking into the grocery store for some time was a stressful experience, as you would just have to hope that enough of what you needed made it to our isolated province. This in turn created a greater pressure on truckers who were continuing to do their job to the best of their ability while having to make unnecessarily long routes to avoid the blockades. 7. I lived in the red zone during the convoy occupation of Ottawa, 6 blocks from Parliament. The abuse and harassment from the convoy was constant and unacceptable. The 18 hours of honking day in, day out was torment. Implements such as the air horns used for commercial trains were employed, which were designed for announcing presence in a wide space at high speeds. When used in a dense urban setting, they resonate off all the buildings and penetrate walls. The idling of trucks was also dangerous and destructive. The air quality at street level, with the 24/7 generation of diesel fumes being trapped by cold air, made breathing difficult for me as someone with asthma. I live in an apartment on the 3rd floor of my building, and even if the trucks hadn't been honking incessantly, I would still have needed to keep all my windows shut and not use my balcony because I could taste the diesel fumes in the air on my balcony. Having people shout at me when I went for groceries was frustrating as well. For all the generalizations people like to make about what it's like to live downtown, the reality is I've never felt unsafe or harassed on the street. And aside from the occasional event promoter on street corners, I've never been accosted on the streets. The convoy people made it very clear that I, by virtue of wearing a mask in public, was their enemy. On multiple nights, convoy people shot off commercial-grade fireworks from the street in the middle of the night. These were the kind of fireworks that have a spread of greater than 25 meters being fired from 2-lane, one-way streets directly adjacent to apartment buildings with open balconies. The sleep disruption of having fireworks go off at midnight, literally outside my building, was infuriating. But the fire hazard this presented was completely unacceptable. Police were called multiple times every time, and their response was always that they're keeping an eye on it. Their standing policy appeared to be being ready to call the fire department just in case, with no intent to intervene otherwise. As an addendum to all this, seeing people openly flying swastikas outside my home did not make me feel remotely safe. I am Jewish, and to see a symbol which unambiguously advocates for the systematic murder of myself and my family being displayed with impunity sends the message, genocide is not something the public deems a concern. The general media response to this further seemed to convey a tone of, what are you going to do? It's a couple of swastikas, that happens. But neglected to consider the presence of a swastika in isolation is very different from when it's flown by a group of hundreds, if not thousands of people with large vehicles who have surrounded your living space while actively intimidating you. While I'm no stranger to discrimination, I have never at any other point in my life felt surrounded by people who wished me dead. It's abhorrent that I'm expected to view this kind of behavior in my community as just how life is, when it very much is not. Eight, I am a 73-year-old Ottawa resident of Sandy Hill, just across the canal from the area occupied by the protesters. I am writing not because I am important, but because I am not. What happened to us happened to tens of thousands in Ottawa from January 28 until the Emergencies Act was enforced. Centretown residents had it much worse. Within 3 days of the occupiers setting up, we were stymied. My regular trip on the O train was disrupted by anti-maskers who aggressively jeered at the masked around them, getting right into their faces. I had to transfer at the Rideau Center to a street-level bus, and twice had white middle-aged men snatch at my mask while demanding freedom from mandates. Returning, I witnessed a large crowd of people near the bus stop, harassing passersby, making an extraordinary amount of noise, blocking traffic, pissing on the street, and generally being obnoxious. I can't say they impressed me, but like many, I thought they'd go home after the weekend. Instead, their continued presence shut down our food stores, pharmacy, bank, and medical clinic for all but telephone consultations. The disruption of O-train and bus service meant we could not access anything in Centretown or North Glebe. We could not get cabs because drivers would not risk crossing Centretown, as several had apparently been attacked by occupiers who objected to the color of their skin and/or to their face masks or both. Gig drivers were also refusing to come to the area. We were prisoners in the few blocks in which we lived due to the threat of illness or violence from people who refused to leave and were able to intimidate the local authorities into acquiescing. Only by shopping at a supermarket a little farther out and early in the day, as the occupiers appeared to be late risers, we were able to get food. A pharmacist at our officially closed pharmacy actually had to sneak in to fill urgent prescriptions for regular customers and arrange backdoor pickup by phone. Like many during the siege, he risked himself and his business to help others. We had to cancel medical appointments and tests, one of which was to ascertain if a lump on my husband's head was a tumor, and if so, whether it was cancerous. Answer received weeks later, yes, it was a tumor, no, it was not cancerous. I had to suspend ongoing treatment for a non-fatal intestinal issue, then start over when the Emergency Act took hold. Sleep was hard to come by as pickups and SUVs drove around our area, blasting horns and a couple of air horns. Sleep is pretty basic to human health and function. 9. In living in the Gladstone Bay area, Centretown, there was no disruption to my life whatsoever by the protest. I could not hear the trucks or their horns at this location, and my freedom of movement on foot or by car was not affected at all. My access to the 417 was entirely unaffected by the protest. I passed through the protest a number of times, usually went out for a run, sometimes went out for a walk, and a couple of times to see the protest itself. I did not experience any harassment on any of these occasions. In terms of signage, I did not personally see anything resembling a swastika or a Confederate flag. I did not wear a mask, but when observing people wearing masks within the protest, I did not see them being harassed. Framing the issue as one where people such as myself who live in the city core were held hostage by the protest is, in my case, incorrect and unwanted. The protest in no way affected me negatively. How many people were actually affected and to what extent remains an open question for me. The trucks were parked north, south, from Wellington to Slater, and east-west from Lyon to Elgin. Most of the buildings in this area are office buildings, the workers of which were still working from home due to prior government actions. There are some street-level businesses, most of which had been required to shut down for extended periods over the previous 2 years. Those that wanted to stay open during the protest were able to do so. For those who were living there, I have no doubt that the protest was incredibly annoying. The problem for me is that the concerns of a group of protesters who possibly outnumbered the residents in the affected area were ignored, dismissed, and vilified, while the inconvenience of a small number of people was made to appear as if all of us living in Ottawa were being held hostage in our own homes. I found and find the lack of balance disturbing. And then finally, I would like to express my experience with the illegal occupation of Ottawa that was brought to end by the invocation of the Emergencies Act. I am a secondary teacher, I work in Ottawa, and I live in Quebec. My route to work was made longer and more complicated by the illegal occupation. After nearly 2 years of trying to support my students through the demands of COVID crisis, I really did not need the added strain that was created by the so-called convoy. More importantly, my students did not need even more stress. I teach students who were affected by the noise of the constant honking and the odor from the vehicles that idled in Ottawa's core. As well, it was certainly disheartening to see the behavior of adults as they danced in the streets, while so many young people had sacrificed so much so that we could follow protocols as safely as possible. Students who missed music, dance, theater, sports, and graduation ceremonies still followed the protocols, while some adults acted as if our public health crisis was a hoax. Finally, it was deeply troubling to see the racist, violent, and threatening message coming from these occupiers. I was most incensed when one organizer threatened to roll schools. He did not organize a roll past my school, but my understanding is that the elementary school down the street was targeted. On my route to work and back, not only was I delayed, I also felt intimidated by the vehicles with flags of various kinds driving aggressively to and from their camp. The most drastic impact that the illegal occupation had on my life was that I was unable to visit my mother on the last weekend she was alive. My mother was grieving for the loss of her son, and after my brother's death in 2019, her quality of life changed radically. While my sister, an essential worker, and her husband were primary caregivers, I tried to visit my mother every weekend. You are probably aware that those of us who live in the Ottawa-Gatineau region experience our communities as more unified than separated. For me to take 2 trips to Orleans on a weekend was not at all unusual until the convoy. On both the Saturday and the Sunday of the last weekend in January, I tried to get across the bridge from Wakefield to Orleans to see my mom. I was not successful either day. The police had closed the route. While I had just seen her on the Tuesday prior to that, I felt she was slipping away and I was concerned. So these people have taken something from me that I can never get back. My mom was a dedicated educator. She was my role model. The illegal occupation of Ottawa stole from me the last moments of my mother's life. I am grateful that the federal government stepped in to end it when local and provincial authorities could not. Well, Commissioner, I believe that reflects as I said, the diverse submissions that we received from the public. Thank you.
Diverse and somewhat divided. Thank you very much. That's the presentation of the public consultation results. I'm going to take a short break just to get our next witness in, and we can move to the next phase. So 5 minutes only to get the next witness in. Thank you.
The commission is in recess for 5 minutes. La commission est levée pour 5 minutes.
Well, that was an interesting presentation. I think the most interesting part about it, I'm going to take my headphones out. I can't listen to myself on a delay. I think the most interesting thing about this presentation were the different views. Sorry, I'll look at the right camera now. The different views from people who were actually in downtown or at the protest, saying that they didn't agree with the people that said that everything was disrupted and it was horrible, and they were shut in and whatnot. And then you had other people who were there that said that that just didn't happen, and they didn't experience those kinds of restrictions or those kinds of problems. Now, I'm sure for anybody living in that downtown area, there were problems to be had for sure. The constant honking was an issue, and that was later dealt with an injunction. The fireworks going off between buildings, probably not the smartest thing for people to be doing, mind you. Protesters, I'm talking to you. Yeah, I support your protest. I don't support you firing off fireworks in between buildings on a downtown street. That's reckless and stupid. Sorry, I don't agree with it. However, why were the police not sent out to deal with these people specifically? And I think that comes to the crux of the issue there is whatever laws were being broken or whatever problematic people were there, they were not being dealt with. And I don't blame the convoy as a whole. You can't control what everybody's going to do. There's no way you can do that. But at the same time, police should have been out there confiscating fireworks, burn barrels, depending on how high it is. If people are keeping it reasonable, I don't see much of an issue with it. Quite often you see that in urban settings where there's a homeless population. They'll have a barrel with whatever they can find burning to help keep them warm. So I don't see that as a huge problem. The idling of trucks, well, I'm sorry, that's got to happen. These people are there living in those trucks. And they have to keep them idling to keep them warm and keep things going there. So we heard about a lot of people choking on the fumes and whatnot, and I don't know, maybe it was. I didn't actually get down there. By the time I was getting ready to go to the protests for a weekend to see for myself, police were busting heads already. That leads me to another point. Some people saying that the police should have been more forceful. I don't know, when you see multiple officers holding someone down while another one repeatedly drives their knee into their rib cage, I don't know how anybody looks at that and says they should have been more forceful. When you see one officer intentionally, and I've seen the video and I will say it was intentional, that he came out from behind another officer with his tear gas gun and dropped a canister right into the leg of that reporter. Unacceptable. It really is. And the fact that these police officers are apparently not being held to account for any of this, I find problematic. I also have a problem with Bill Blair stating that what he saw was textbook policing. And as a comment I made on Twitter, yeah, sure, if the book was written in 1942. So yes, there were diverse views there. And I think Justice Rouleau made the point, what was the word he said? I don't even remember what word he said. Yeah, they were diverse and divided, I think is what he said. Yeah. And that is exactly what it was supposed to be. As per the government plan, Trudeau's plan was to divide. It's not just my opinion. It's been stated by a member of the Liberal Party in open parliament, an MP. I believe his name was Lightbound, said that Trudeau did make the decision to divide the country. And this, folks, is the result. And yes, it was an international embarrassment.
Order allowed.
We're coming back, so I'm going to switch back, and we'll let you listen in instead of listening to me yap.
À merveille.
The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Eric Rousseau, Commission Counsel. Just very briefly before we get going with the next witness, I'm just going to formally bulk enter a number of documents that were on lists in several categories. The first being 28 documents which were the subject of objections, which were worked out amongst council. They are HRF, OPP, OPS, City of Ottawa, and several commission documents. The second is a list of largely, but not exclusively, federal government documents, which was circulated to the parties on November 9th. And objections were dealt with or removed, and that's a total of 1,766 documents. The third is a list, again, of largely federal government documents, but as well as a number of others, which was sent on November 14th. Objections were removed and dealt with, and that's another 819 documents. And the fourth, as the parties were advised this morning, is the affidavit of Superintendent Bernier, which was circulated by counsel for OPS on Monday. No objections were received. No party sought leave to cross-examine on it, and the parties were advised that it was being admitted today. And with that done, I'll let Mr. Cameron take the floor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioners. Gordon Cameron for Commission Counsel, and my friend for the Attorney General has a statement she'd like to make with respect to the evidence of this witness before I commence my questioning.
Okay.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioner. It's Andrea Gonzalez, Counsel for the Government of Canada. The next witness will be Minister of Justice David Lemetti. In addition to being Minister of Justice, of course, the Minister is the Attorney General of Canada, the lawyer to the Government of Canada. And I wanted to put on the record that the Government of Canada continues to assert and maintain all of its claims of solicitor-client privilege in respect of all legal advice and opinions. Minister Lemetti's attendance here as a witness is not a waiver of any claims of privilege by the Government of Canada, which he has an obligation to protect. We will be objecting to, and Minister Lemetti will be refusing to answer all questions that would delve into areas of solicitor-client privilege. So I just wanted to put that on the record at the front end, and hopefully examinations can be appropriately tailored to keep the objections to a minimum.
Okay, well, it will be an interesting maneuver throughout the testimony, but I'm sure everyone will be on their guard. So with that, perhaps we can swear the witness.
Minister Lemetti, will you swear on a religious document or do you wish to affirm?
On a Bible, please. Thank you.
For the record, please state your full name and spell it out.
David Lemetti, D-A-V-I-D, L-A-M-E-T-T-I.
Do you swear that the evidence to be given by you to this commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do swear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, Commissioner Gordon Cameron for Commission Counsel, and good morning, Minister Lemetti.
Good morning.
I will begin with some housekeeping and ask you to cast your mind back to September 6th of this year when I interviewed you along with some of my colleagues from Commission Counsel, and we prepared a summary of that interview. And for the record, in case anybody's looking for the number, it is WTS 6077. Minister Lemetti, did you have an opportunity to review that summary for accuracy?
Yes, I did.
And can you confirm it's accurate and that you adopt it as part of your evidence in this proceeding?
I confirm its accuracy.
Thank you. Now, if we can begin, suppose with the basics, I think a lot of what we would describe as your position and your responsibilities are already familiar to many of the parties here. But just so that those for whom it isn't familiar and for members of the public, could you describe your office? And since I'm going to be taking you to some particulars, but also if you could give us an overview of the dual role you play as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and just describe how that plays out in the context of the work you do in conjunction with the government and cabinet.
Thank you. They are two complicated roles, and it is an important question. As Minister of Justice, I'm a member of cabinet. I'm responsible for what one might call justice policy and the development of justice policy, the curation of the criminal code, various institutions, Human Rights Commission, for example, and other Privacy Commission, other commissions that are associated with justice policy writ large in Canada. So they fall under my purview. I do not, I'll frame that, I'll come back to that when I talk about the Attorney General role. So in that role, I'm a member of cabinet. I participate in cabinet discussions, give my opinions as would any other cabinet minister, and do the work reading my documents, but also other documents from other ministers in that regard, and giving informed opinions. The other role is Attorney General. I'm the government lawyer, also sit at the cabinet table as Attorney General, and I give legal advice to the government. I receive legal advice from time to time through the Department of Justice, which has lawyers dedicated to giving legal advice in that Attorney General role. I'm the titular head on litigation, all the litigation that the Government of Canada does. And I have a role in shaping that litigation, particularly as it approaches higher courts, courts of appeal and the Supreme Court. And again, in that role, I will give advice to the cabinet and to the Prime Minister directly from time to time. On most pieces of legislation, for example, there will be opinions being given, although there are occasional mentions in the Justice Act of the Minister of Justice giving that role. So I will, the lines are reasonably well demarcated. They certainly are well demarcated in my mind. We've had the Anne McClellan report of a few years back, which helped in the framing of certain kinds of litigation to distinguish the roles. And certainly I would say that in all of my interactions with colleagues, including informal interactions, I will always try to be clear which hat I am wearing as I'm speaking. And if that hat changes in the course of a conversation, I will give them a flag. And so I'm well aware of that of those two roles. What I will also say, this is the part that I had bracketed out before, is unlike the Attorney General of the United States, I do not lead investigations and prosecutions. We have an independent prosecution service, and there are other rules that guide my relationship with the Director of Public Prosecutions. But that's important to remember as well.
Thank you, and thank you for referencing the report of the Honourable Anne McClellan, and I'm going to make a few references to it because I think they help. As you might remember, she had some compact and forceful ways of describing the two roles, and I'm going to ask that be put up on the screen just so that we can look at it, and I'll ask you to see if they accord with your understanding of your role. Mr. Clerk, the document number is COM 50952. And if you can get that up on the screen, I'll ask you to go to page 6 at the top. Now, we don't need to know, for my purposes at least, Minister Lemetti, the background to Anne McClellan's report, but
I know it well.
Yes, I imagine you read it very, very carefully when it came out. But she was reviewing the roles of the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice, and she had things to say about it in other contexts. But I'm just going to talk about her introductory comments, where she describes in an overview way, I think in most cases, quoting from Professor Edwards, about the roles as they're known in our constitutional system of government. So the first one, if I'm trying to get the top of page 6, Mr. Clerk, and that doesn't look like it to me. It might be that it's a different PDF number. The top says introduction. There we go. And the sentence I'll read is the second one. The Attorney General of Canada has a unique and profoundly important role. They stand at the heart of accountable government as the person responsible for defending the rule of law by ensuring that all government action is in accordance with the Constitution, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I take it from your earlier description that you would agree with her description of that part of your role.
Completely.
And then if we go over, Mr. Clerk, to page 10, if we're working with the same page numbers, it is the page that has the heading, the Attorney General of Canada. There we go. And I'll just read, there's a historical introduction here. The sentence I wanted to concentrate on was the second one. For that reason, the Attorney General is often referred to as the Chief Law Officer of the Crown. And you're probably familiar with that phrase. Again, I think, if not invented by, certainly most written about by Professor Edwards in his work. And then 2 paragraphs down there, the paragraph that begins, in their role. In their role of Chief Law Officer of the Crown, the Attorney General is not accountable to a particular government. They are required to act according to the law and the broader public interest, not according to personal or partisan interests. And again, as I understand your introductory comments, you'd agree with those observations of Anne McClellan as well?
Again, completely.
Right. And then if we can go over a page, perhaps 2 pages, Mr. Clerk, to the page that has at the top of it the Minister of Justice. And here we have the description of the other role, and we'll just do this as compactly as possible with the first sentence. Under the Department of Justice Act, the Minister of Justice is the legal advisor to the Governor General, which means in practice that they are the legal advisor to Cabinet. And again, that would accord with your understanding of your role?
That's right. I alluded to that in my opening remarks.
Thank you. I'd like to take you to some of the documents. These were produced fairly recently to us, and so they aren't organized in my papers, or at least to the extent Commission Counsel has been able to organize them relative to the way they were filed. And I know just from some emails that have come in as we've been preparing for this morning's appearance by you, other parties might have struggled with this as well. So I'll try to help parties along with the way I have organized them, at least. And the first one, Mr. Clerk, if you could call up SSM CAN 407845. And Minister Lemetti, we're all going to, you and I think the people following are going to have to struggle with 2 things here. One is how one reads a text conversation when it gets printed out like this, especially when it's broken up into multiple pages. Who is speaking in which bubble as we go down? So I'll ask you to help me with that. I believe that the first bubble there, do we have a contingency? That is you speaking, am I correct there?
I believe that's right.
Okay, the date here is Sunday, January 30th, which would be, you might remember, the Sunday of the first weekend of the convoy arrival in Ottawa, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And can you explain, by the way, if I understand it correctly, and just look down a bit, this is a text exchange you're having with Alex Steinhaus, who I believe is your Chief of Staff?
I believe so, yes.
Thank you.
I believe it's a text exchange with him. I know he's my Chief of Staff.
and if, as near as I can follow it, you're in gray and he's in blue for this page, and that gets tricky because it switches around as we go between, depending on whose phone the message is from. Anyway, if we look at the first paragraph there, do we have a contingency for these trucks to be removed tomorrow or Tuesday, open parentheses, if they were Black or Indigenous, ellipsis, close parentheses. And I was wondering if you can help explain what point you were making to your chief of staff when you added the parenthetical comment to the initial statement.
Certainly. Look, there is evidence of systemic racism in our justice system. It's in my mandate letter. I do my best to try to root it out with various policies. And certainly there was a legitimate criticism being leveled at police authorities with respect to that weekend, that if there had been a Black Lives Matter protest or an Indigenous protest, that perhaps the police reaction might have been different. This is a conversation between Mr. Steinhaus and myself. It's not meant to be public. Obviously, it's in a text. But I am sensitive to claims of systemic racism in our policing. I'm sensitive to systemic racism in our criminal justice system, and I'm doing my best in the areas of my purview to identify it and to weed it out.
And so if I understand that answer, the point you're making in the parenthetical comment to your chief of staff is we must approach this situation mindful of the potential for systemic racism and careful that we don't...
I would interpret it more as, are the police moving in the same way that they would be were the protesters Indigenous or Black?
That's well put. So I'll move on to the next paragraph. What normative authority do we have, or is some order needed, question mark, EA, question mark. And there's been an evolution in the language, and in particular the use of the word normative. So could you just help us with what you meant by this use there?
What kinds of laws, bylaws exist at the municipal level, at the provincial level, or at the federal level with respect to this kind of occupation, which had already, it was clear that when they didn't leave, it ceased being a protest and began being an occupation. What kind of authorities existed for the regulation or the
Okay, so we can...
The safe removal of these.
If we can just put what existing authority in there, if normative is giving us pause.
I meant legal rules by the word normative. I'm an old academic.
So you're in the old school with me, okay. But the end of the sentence is interesting. EA, I'm sure, is a reference to the Emergencies Act.
Absolutely.
And this is depending on how you count it, it's the second day of the first weekend, maybe the third day of the protest, if you count Friday as a day. So the second or third day of the protest, and your mind goes straight to the Emergencies Act in the first text we get produced in these proceedings. Can you explain why that came so quickly to your mind?
I was being prudent. I was being prudent.
Thank you.
I had been through the pandemic with my cabinet colleagues. It is no secret that we did discuss the Emergencies Act in the context of the pandemic, and I became quite familiar with the requirements for consultation and for the standards that would have to be met, the 4 different kinds of emergencies. And so I knew that we had to begin thinking about it, whether or not it was ever going to be an option. As was the case with the pandemic, we never actually used it. So it's something that I prudently raised there's a question mark there, as you see, something I'm prudently raising with my chief of staff to begin thinking about, to get the department to begin thinking about, in case we need it. Because the worst scenario would be something explodes and we are not ready to use it because we haven't done the kinds of consultations necessary or asked the appropriate questions to the appropriate people in order to get it done. So this is me being prudent, and it's based on my experience and the work that I put in during the pandemic, again, with the Emergencies Act and the possibility of using it in that context.
That's helpful, thank you. And we'll go to another one of these texts next. This is, Mr. Clerk, the one with the same preceding numbers, but the last 4 digits, 7850. Now, again, trying to follow the bubbles here, the blue is now you or Mr. Steinhaus?
I don't believe it's me because I'm generally required to go to what's called a MINDM, which is a ministerial, deputy ministerial meeting. So if anyone's missing the meeting, it's not me.
Right, and I think actually the first bubble there doesn't sound like you talking. It sounds like someone talking to you about what your deputy has told you, that you're being invited to a meeting about the convoy. And if it matters, we can look at the PCO's chronology to confirm that there was indeed a briefing on the convoy on that date. But the part that interests me here is your chief of staff in the second bubble says, and here he's talking, before you were talking about your initial thoughts on first encountering the convoy, we're now at Wednesday, February 2nd, so fourth, fifth day perhaps in. But
I apologize for interrupting.
Sorry?
But it's February the 4th where those bubbles appear, not Wednesday the 2nd.
Sorry, thank you, yes. Friday, February 4th, and the comment your chief of staff makes is, I believe the angle is incoming the Emergencies Act. Now, we'll have to, can you help us with incoming, or does it just mean what we would infer it as a sort of slang way of saying the introduction of, or the?
I would say the preparatory work for.
Right.
Is what I understood by that. And certainly in the context of the previous bubble, but also in the context of other discussions. It was about preparing for the possibility, not preparing in any way for the introduction of the act, but rather doing our due diligence as lawyers within the Justice Department and in our ministry in order to make sure that if we were to use it, we would be prepared.
Understood, and that's helpful. Thank you. And do you recollect the meeting and what was discussed at it?
You're going to have to help me with the dates. It could be referring to the SSE committee. I believe at that point that's what it would be. It could have been a cabinet meeting. I'm not certain. You'll have to help me with the dates.
Well, if it sounds a bit early for an SS meeting to me, but I guess the point is that as near as you can recollect it is exactly as you described it, a meeting to get ready.
Yeah, there's no, I don't believe there's an extraordinary meeting yet. And so this is really about being ready for all eventualities.
Okay. The next text I'd like to take you to is really leading up to a discussion about how you and Minister of Public Safety, Marco Mendicino, talked about the situation that Ottawa was facing and to some extent the country was facing, even at this early date. And so, Mr. Clerk, if you could turn up the document that is the same prefix but with the number 7852. And if I'm reading the dates correctly, we are still on Friday, February 4th, as in the last exchange, but though that was with your chief of staff, I think. This, if I'm understanding correctly, and you can confirm this for me, please, is an exchange between you and Minister Mendicino?
I certainly believe it is. I certainly recognize my words there, but I believe the other would be Minister Mendicino, but I'm not 100% certain.
And which words do you claim?
I claim the green.
Okay. So Minister Mendicino says to you The police have all the legal authority they need to enforce the law. They just need to exercise it and do their job. You might, if you've been following the evidence of Minister Blair and others who made similar comments.
Loosely, we do have other work to do while we're here.
Understood. And then you make a comment, again, perhaps not unique to yourself, but expressed very, very frankly here. I was stunned by the lack of a multi-layered plan. Now, we've heard other expressions like contingency plan, but not multi-layered. Can you, are they the same thing? Is that what you mean here?
I don't believe so. I believe it's a structured plan in stages to get protesters to leave peacefully, get occupiers to leave peacefully, and if not peacefully, begin to move them out in an orderly fashion, in a safe fashion. So there are different layers to that.
Understood. So if I'll just interrupt you to see if I can anticipate what you're going to say. You're actually thinking of a plan to deal with the protest by February 4th. You're stunned by the absence of a plan.
Right, and this is referring to local police, the police of jurisdiction.
The Ottawa police not having a plan.
That's correct.
By that Friday. And you make again in stark terms the observation slowly is incompetent. And the words speak for themselves, but was that an observation you were making specific to the situation you were looking at, or was that an opinion that you had developed from some other?
I'm a part-time resident of Ottawa. I was a part-time resident of Ottawa during this. I was forced out of my living arrangements in Ottawa because I felt that the place I was living was unsafe given the protests. So I spent part of my time elsewhere in Ottawa, and I spent part of my time in Montreal in order to escape Ottawa. So I was frustrated, I have to admit. This is a complete product of the heat of the moment. It is frank. I think I would soften it now with the benefit of hindsight with respect to the former Ottawa Chief of Police. But it reflects, I think, the fact that my life had been altered by this. My staff was being harassed when they went into work by convoy members who took issue with them wearing masks, particularly my female staff members on my ministerial team. And I was quite frustrated, I will admit.
Thank you for that. Now, for a second, I'd like us to revert to the comments we talked about at the beginning, where your role was described as, and you acknowledged as being, the chief law officer of the Crown in your capacity as Attorney General, and effectively Cabinet's lawyer in your capacity as Minister of Justice. And is it fair to say that you would expect your Cabinet colleagues to place considerable weight on your views of the legal issues that were facing the government as it encountered the convoy, the protests, and indeed the policing situation that you just opined on in your note about Chief Slowly?
In these kinds of interactions, I'm interacting, first of all, with a colleague and a friend. So there will be banter. There will be occasional attempts at bad humor on both parts and with others as well. And there will be occasional moments of frustration, which you've seen here. I'm speaking here more as a Cabinet colleague, as a minister. I'm not speaking as Attorney General. I will guard my comments when I'm giving legal advice to my Cabinet colleagues, and I do that often. In general, I think it's fair to say that when I'm interacting on text messaging with my colleagues, I'm acting as one of their contemporaries as a minister.
Okay, well, let's see how that plays out if with respect to the particular point that has come under discussion by a number of senior officials, a number of police officials, indeed the two witnesses at least who've preceded you, Minister Mendicino and Minister Blair, and that is the line between, I think it was perhaps First Commissioner Lucky who called it the line between church and state, but it's generally understood as the